Hi, my name is Luis Rodriguez, and today I'll present to you via Zoom. For Unit 1 project, I chose to do it on Kate Chopin. And right here on the right side, you'll see a picture of her. In her early years, before being known as Kate Chopin, she was Catherine O'Flaherty, and she was from St. Louis, Missouri, born on February 8th, 1850. On her mother's side, she was French, so she's half French, half American. So she grew up biculturally and bilingually. She attended school at St. Louis Academy at the Sacred Heart. Her childhood was scarred with death. Her father died in a railroad accident. Her great grandmother died, and her brother died as well. In adulthood, at the age of 20, Kate married Oscar Chopin, a wealthy Louisiana man with ambitious business goals. And that's him right here on the right. And these are all their kids, which they had six of. And they settled in New Orleans, Louisiana. Her husband died in 1882 from malaria, leaving her a single parent of six children, so she moved back to Missouri with her mother. The beginning of her writing career started soon after her move back, and her time in Louisiana was very important because it had the largest influence on her work. She used a lot of regionalism for Louisiana in her stories. Chopin died on August 22nd, 1904, from a cerebral brain hemorrhage after attending a local fair on a particularly hot day. Kate Chopin wrote tons of stories, but only had top five works. She wrote two novels and hundreds of short stories. Her top five works were The Awakening, a novel, The Story of an Hour, short story, The Storm, short story, The Sears Baby, short story, and The Katie and Ball, short story. Other notable works are At Fault, which was a novel, A Pair of Silk Stockings, and A Respectable Woman. Awards and works. Chopin used a great amount of regionalism in her works, mostly about her time in Louisiana. They also were centered on the lives of sensitive, intelligent women, the kind of women she wished she could be. Her writing style featured many different elements of writing, like romanticism, existentialism, realism, naturalism, and feminism. Chopin did not receive many awards during her time because her works were very controversial, but later she did receive some honors for her skills as a writer. A star on the St. Louis Walk of Fame, her home is now a National Historic Landmark, as I put it right here, which is pretty neat. And she received an iron bust of her head, which is at the Writers' Corner in St. Louis. Works featured many different ideas. One that I want to start with is racism. Chopin was well known for talking about controversial topics that no one wanted to mention. One topic she covered was racism. Racism was still common during this time because the Civil War and Reconstruction era were only a few years ago. In This Year's Baby, the story features a non-white baby born to a supposedly all-white couple, and the father is a slave owner. Once he finds out the baby isn't white, he believes it is the mother's fault and wants both of them to leave. He says that the child is not white. It means that you are not white. He says that to his wife. Chopin uses the story to show how deep racism ran by illustrating how a baby's own father cannot love his child because it was not white. A second idea was feminism. Chopin is thought to be one of the first proponents of feminism and an integral part to its evolution. Many of her stories, such as The Story of an Hour, The Storm, and The Awakening, feature strong leading women. Chopin didn't seek to become a social reformer or advocate for women's rights. She simply sought to write about how women truthfully lived their lives and how their relationships with their husbands truthfully were also. In A Story of an Hour, a wife gets news of her husband's death, and instead of being upset, she is thrilled to hear the news, for she feels free to be who she wants to do, free to be who she wants and do whatever she wants. This parallels Chopin's new experience with her husband's death because once he died, soon her writing career began. Third idea was adultery. Chopin discussed adultery in The Storm, but she also features a lack of justice in the end, making the story a very controversial one at the time. The Storm. The story involves two married adults with families who commit adultery during a storm, but the adulterers are never caught, nor do they show any guilt for their action. She then ends the story by stating, "So the storm passed and everyone was happy." Chopin was unhappy in her marriage, so she wanted to express how other women might have also been unhappy in their marriages. She used the act of adultery as a sign of freedom from the constraints of marriage, because the couple here, instead of abiding by their vows, committed adultery and cheated on their families. Chopin lacks a moral guilt and justice in story, which upsets the readers of her time period, for they were used to justice, retribution during the post-Civil War era. A fourth idea covered in Chopin's writing is life and death. Chopin illustrates this in The Story of an Hour. Chopin's life was marked with death from a very young age, but her view of it was different from others. She had family members that passed away that she was very upset to lose, and others not so much. The Story of an Hour is one example of a not so sad death. The story features a wife, who isn't sad over the death of her husband, but instead is relieved upon hearing the news. She said it over and over under her breath, free, free, free. Her pulse beat, and the coursing blood warmed and relaxed every inch of her body, which means that she was happy for her husband's death, which is something that was not common in society. Common Chopin Chopin's view of death is that of an existentialist. Story an Hour, she used death as a way for Mrs. Mallard, the wife, to be free and seek a newfound purpose in her life. A fifth idea is realism, which was something she often did in her writing. Realism was a popular writing style during Chopin's period. She herself used it in her work. Chopin's Désir's Baby is an example of realism writing. In Désir's Baby, Chopin features the truth behind how life was during the time. During the story, husband casts the wife and baby because he suspects they are not white, which shows how people of the time still had prejudice towards people of a different skin tone post-Civil War. The realism movement during the time was gaining more traction for reasons like this because it would expose how different types of people live their lives, and if there were any injustice like prejudice shown throughout works, it could lead to justice/change. And criticism is common throughout like any profession, especially writers. And Chopin had received criticism throughout her writing career, which was both good and bad. One critic in 1956, Kenneth Ebel, praised Chopin's creativity and imagination in her works. In The Awakening, he described Chopin's imagination as the imaginative life, which seems to have gone on from early childhood somewhat beneath and apart from her well-regulated actual existence. He says that Chopin's imagination and creativity she uses in her writing seems to have began from an early age and only gotten better as the years have gone by. This was an example of good criticism. The criticism is important because it explains how Chopin was able to write so many stories during her time because of her grand imagination. And there's, of course, more criticism. Chopin's The Storm is one of her stories that received the most negative criticism. Modern-day critic Maria Herbert-Leitzer argues that the characters in the story are portrayed wrongfully, selfish, and immoral. She says through the story, Chopin seems to be arguing for human passion and desire, but not at the cost of marriage. Many people during the time of the story release also felt that the story was morally wrong and needed a different ending. The lack of justice and guilt in the story made it a controversial topic and still is now. The criticism is important because it shows how not everyone appreciated how Chopin wrote about controversial topics at this time, but she continued anyways in other stories, which is something I admire about her. She did not care and wrote about what she thought was right. Third example of criticism, Chopin's Story of an Hour is one where criticism was both good and bad for her mix of personal experiences and feelings in the story's main character, Mrs. Mallard. Critic Christopher Benfey discussed Chopin's history of marriage as being was a lifelong connoisseur of rickety marriages, and all her wisdom is on display in her piercing analysis of this thoroughly average one. Benfey is praising Chopin's use of realism in the story because her marriage experience in the story is mirrored by her character, Mrs. Mallard. Benfey is also insulting Chopin by stating how her marriage was not an ideal one and how Mrs. Mallard reacting to the news of her husband's death was her reaction and not that of the average married person. This criticism is important because some people during Chopin's time didn't like how she wrote about women in unhappy marriages because it went against society's portrayal of them, so she was met with a lot of criticism for this. And for Chopin, once like her husband died, she moved back home and started her writing career, so she didn't have the best relationship or wanted to be married that way. The fourth example of criticism, and here's a picture of this year's baby in a video. Chopin is known for writing stories with a lot of secret meaning and messages. She achieved that just brilliantly in this year's baby. In the story, as critic Griffin Wolf points out, Chopin illustrates that human situations can never be as clear as black and white. The themes that Chopin tried to express, according to Woolf, were bleak fact that life is uncertain, unsettled, full of tenuous stabilities. This criticism is important because Woolf, like other critics as authors, admires Chopin's skillful use of themes and messages to convey points in her work. There's this here, there's her baby, and there's the Bayou of Louisiana. A fifth example of criticism. Chopin wrote many stories, and collectively many people had various different opinions of her, but a bibliographer slash critic of her, Bernard Koluski, would say, whether you like her or not, Chopin had an effect on the world. After the 1970s, when a remarkable literary revival made her work famous around the world, Chopin became inspiration for artists of all kinds, women and men. This criticism is important because it shows how influential and well-known Chopin was in the world. It also tells how even several years past her death, her work still inspires writers. In my opinion of Kate Chopin, I personally wanted to do my presentation of Kate Chopin because I love her work. Kate Chopin writes about the truth, addresses the problems in society most people try to avoid, like racism, adultery, feminism, and many other things. Also, her use of realism and regionalism make her stories more relatable and entertaining. Chopin used her skills as a writer to help shine light on whatever topic she wanted, and her work was usually influential in that regard. I would compare her impact as a writer to that of a popular modern day YouTuber because she used short stories to talk about a particular issue, and many people would read it and their perspectives on that issue would be transformed. And short stories are pretty much like short YouTube videos where, like, if you're influential enough, people keep recommending them and talking about them. In my opinion, continued, Kate Chopin was also a good, respectable person. She had a very difficult and traumatic past, but she still found a way to overcome it and become one of the most well-known writers in history. She experienced more setbacks in her life as she got older. She lost her husband in her early 30s, forcing her to move back home and take care of 6 children, which is a lot. But instead of giving up in her life, she used the time to launch her writing career. Kate Chopin is inspiration and definitely one of my favorite writers and people. And these are the sources I use to get all my information from. Hi, now I'm going to go over my presentation questions. Why did the author work literary movement inspire you? Okay, Kate Chopin inspires me because she is one of the most well-known authors of her time, but she had a tough journey to get there. Her childhood and adulthood were full of death and many setbacks, but she didn't let that stop her from starting her writing career. Also, as a writer, she wrote about anything she wanted, and that included topics no one wanted to talk about. Chopin is an inspiration to never give up, to persevere, and to become and be true to yourself. I created a PowerPoint. And how does your presentation represent the author or work? My presentation represents Kate Chopin because I talked about Chopin and her works throughout her life. I begin by talking about Chopin's personal life and career, then I talk about her works, what ideas they were meant to express. Afterwards, I reviewed how many critics thought about her and her works because some of her works were controversial and that upset many people. Lastly, I ended my presentation with my personal opinion of Kate Chopin. And the medium I used was PowerPoint because I'm good at them and I felt it would be the best way to talk about Kate Chopin. And for materials, I did all this on my MacBook and I used Zoom to record this, like standard classroom style nowadays. And the color, sounds, objects represents, okay, the pictures and layout in my presentation are visual representations of how my information should look in a clear, understandable way. I wanted everything to be simple with the white background and everything. That way you can tell what the information is and the pictures to give it like more visual representation. And the placement of my slides and information set in chronological order and each individual bullet is placed under its appropriate topic. And I wanted to capture the community behind Chopin's works and who she is. Are there any modern day examples in your project examples that parallel the author, work, literary movement? Modern day criticism and comparisons are in my presentation to help the viewers better understand how other people perceive her and what they thought of her works, which I put in about 5 different critics, both good and bad, both modern and contemporary. And Kate Chopin really did hit home. I already had a good amount of respect for Chopin, but this presentation helped me learn more about her and her life and her contributions to society. Chopin was a very talented writer whose writing led to great praise and was influential in whatever topic she discussed. And that is it for my presentation.